Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake by myself today, actually, but I have a whole cast of characters that are joining us on this special episode. And one of the things that you may have seen across the bourbon and whiskey landscape is this idea of independent bottlers, and that has come to the United States in a big way. And we are joined by the folks from Lost Lantern, Adam and Nora, as well as the folks from American Mash and Grain. You've heard them here on the Bourbon Lens previously, but today we're going to talk about independent bottling with them. So Chase and Devin, thank you all for joining this episode of the Bourbon Lens.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great. You know, Adam and Nora, we've all hung out on Instagram Live a few times, and, you know, we've done the podcast with the guys from American Mash and Grain before, but it's good because I think this is an important conversation. We actually, you know, have had a little bit of a run on talking about this behind the scenes, and it's kind of all over the place. But I'd be remiss to say that this is our second time actually trying to make this happen. We had, rural Vermont. We had me changing my internet connection. We had Devin and Chase like sharing a room with God knows what kind of internet connection, and it didn't work. So I appreciate you all rejoining the conversation. And now that we've fixed all the blunders, right? And in the meantime, you've all gotten to meet in person. So, you know, can you all talk about your all's connection at ADI a few weeks ago?
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the American Distilling Institute conference in Denver and had just landed and popped right into the Whiskey Summit session about which at that particular moment was about independent bottling, and sat down in the back, and right in front of me were these two. And said hi right away, and then after the summit, we got to chat a little bit, taste each other's whiskey, introduce each other to some folks. It was really a fun experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a failed first attempt at a podcast recording is a great icebreaker. So we wound up sitting right behind us. It was a natural segue on the topic. So it was great to make a connection.
Well, and Adam tried to slide in to that and sit in the back, and then immediately got called on by the people running that panel. Basically, like, you know, flew in, showed up, walked in the back, and then all of a sudden had a microphone in his hand, standing on the side of the room.
Yeah, I woken up at like 3 a.m. to fly there from Denver, where I've been visiting some distilleries, and I just gotten there, and it was like 9 a.m. I'd gotten in the room maybe 5 minutes before, and suddenly I'm talking to a whole room of people, and I was probably not the most coherent I've ever been, but I still got the idea.
I'm sure.
Oh, that's awesome. You gotta love being called on like first thing, and you're trying to be stealthy, and just doesn't happen. And you know, you all at least had a commonality. You were like that Jake and Scott, those two guys, man, they're pieces of work. So you could bag on somebody right away, and that nothing like bagging on somebody just to like build camaraderie. Exactly. Yeah, I know. So for everyone who doesn't know what independent bottling is, it's been going on for years across the world, but coming to America, this is not the Eddie Murphy movie. It is definitely a new concept, and people don't really understand this. So I'm going to go to Nora and Adam on this one. Nora in particular, can you just explain to the listeners what independent bottling is and what it does for the consumer and the brands behind it? Because you all have countless releases. I think, you know, over 20 different independent bottlings at this point that you have done.
Yeah. Very happy to talk about independent bottling, and I'll try to keep it short. But we have a lot more to say about it. But for us at Lost Lantern, when we think of independent bottler, we think of the Scottish tradition. And that has been going on for over 200 years now. And that is basically these grocery stores would buy whiskey from distilleries all over Scotland, and they would blend it together. So that's actually where Dewar's and Johnnie Walker started. But some people went the blending route, and then the independent bottlers that still exist in Scotland started doing single casks and blends, and they gave access to whiskey that you wouldn't get access to otherwise, because they were used in a blend, because it's a style that distillery doesn't put out themselves. For example, for Scotch drinkers, an unpeated Lefroy, which is unheard of, but an independent bottler would put that out. So when we started Lost Lantern, we come from the Scottish tradition. We also drink a lot of American whiskey. We love bourbon and rye. And we saw an opportunity to bring that model, specifically when it comes to finding great whiskey that's made all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the US, whiskey is so regionally focused and is becoming more so. So people who don't live in Ohio, people who don't live in Texas won't know the great distilleries that exist there. So we wanted to bring that side of independent bottling to the States with Lost Lantern and shine a light on the great distilleries that are doing things that feel very regionally focused.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. And Devin and Chase, you all started in a little bit different journey, right? You all started by actually writing about these smaller craft distilleries in long format, right? So go over to mashandgrain.com and you can find these long form, content pieces that you all put out. And then you all have slowly got into this. So what was it from you all going from creating these really descriptive, beautiful pieces I've learned a lot about over my time, to actually getting into acquiring casks and blending it your all selves and doing your own way of independent bottling?
Yeah, I mean, so we started the website a little over 3 years ago, and I think the idea was to just kind of tell stories. Storytelling is very important to us, and we felt like when we were looking at the landscape of what was available about craft producers or small scale whiskey producers, a lot of it on the internet was tasting notes. And not very many people were really telling the full story. Who are these people? Why did they make this decision to open a distillery? Why whiskey? How are they making it? What makes their product different than, Kentucky bourbon or whatever you might be used to? So, I come from a background. I've worked for several different craft distilleries. Chase has been working in brand storytelling for much of his career. So it was really a way for us to combine our two interests and our two expertise and tell holistic stories of these incredible producers. Now, this also started over COVID. So a part of it was also just finding a way to stay connected to each other. When we started the company, I lived in Brooklyn, New York. He lived in New Orleans. We now both live in Denver, which is the first time we've lived in the same city as each other since we were 18 years old. So it's just been, all of it's been kind of a gift. But from the very beginning, when we launched the website, we thought we might release some products of our own. And we imagined that those would be sourcing whiskey from these distilleries that we were featuring. But we kind of initially thought it would just be, let's blend a bourbon together. Let's blend a rye. It wasn't until a couple years into the endeavor that the concept behind sort of the Borrowed Page project and exclusively focusing on American blended whiskey sort of became something that we were interested in, putting our flag in the ground there.
And I'll add one thing real quick. I mean, this whole tradition of independent bottlers, we're very well aware of it now, but when we kind of came up with the original concept, it was not a part of our dialogue, right? That we kind of fell backwards into that, way of expressing whiskey, just because we thought that if we took a little bit of a distillery, say in Ohio and Indiana, who are both doing a great project, or doing, creating great products, put them together, in a well-crafted blend, then all of a sudden we would kind of cross-pollinate each, their respective consumer bases, and people in Indiana would learn about Ohio and vice versa. And then we kind of fell backwards into independent bottling, whereas the storytelling, the introducing people to these independent craft producers was really the original kind of concept and motivation behind Borrowed Page.
No, I think that's awesome. And Nora and Adam, you all have gotten into blending as well, right? So you all started off really around a lot of single cask, and then you all got into the American vatted malt, which I think was the first blend, which I still to the day is one of my favorite vatted American single malts. It's just the less harsh one that I've ever had. It brings characteristics of the Scotch influence into America, which well done on that. Needless to say, but one of the things is Devin showed a bottle, and this is probably one of the unique things. From an Ohio distillery that was just acquired. Let's talk about that for a second, because there's so much acquisition in American whiskey right now. How does that change the concept of an independent bottler when the one distillery I'm talking about? Just go search any of our websites, you'll know about this. And I guess I can say it's public, not Watershed, right? So they were just purchased. How does that change your all's relationship and dynamic? Because you all have had a lot of Watershed products in the past.
it's a really interesting part of how the landscape is evolving. And these places that started off as, in many cases, as small, like personal passion projects, have now gotten to the point where they're real businesses that are exciting companies that are much larger than that to come in and buy them. But I think that even the places that are getting acquired are still not at anywhere near the kind of scale you see in Kentucky. These are not places making 100,000 barrels a year, let alone 2 or 3 million. So they still need other ways to get their whiskey out there, to get their name out there. And I think working with independent bottlers is a way to help with that.
And for us, we're looking for whiskey that has a sense of place when it comes down to it. Like, the scale of the distillery doesn't actually come into our conversations. So it's more about, are they adding to the conversation, or can we add something by putting their whiskey out to the conversation about what is American whiskey? So I think we've worked with brands that get acquired after we work with them. We worked with brands like Smooth Ambler, like Westward, like Westland, that are already owned by another company. And for us, as long as that company is not saying, hey, we own you, now make Kentucky style bourbon, for us, it doesn't actually besides the negotiation about putting their name on the bottle, which does become more difficult with places with a parent company, it doesn't change our interaction with them at all.
Yeah. I agree with Nora completely, basically. It's funny, while we were producing volume 1 of Borrowed Page, Wiggle whiskey, which is one of the component whiskeys in it, got purchased. So, which is interesting. We've noticed it also in because we're still featuring distilleries on the website every month. Sometimes we'll be in the middle of a conversation about setting up an interview with a distillery, and then they'll get bought, and suddenly it's like the line gets disconnected. I think that's a little bit more about just like transition of, not power, but once you get bought by a bigger company, there are a lot more cooks in the kitchen, I guess is a way to put it. So, and there's a lot to get caught up on. Thank you for the plug. But yeah, I think I agree with Nora. It doesn't really change the conversation as long as these are still producers and distilleries that are doing something authentic, and doing something, specific to them and to their region or to their story, and that a company isn't coming in and changing everything about who they are and what they do. I think it just becomes more of a legal battle to get that juice.
Gotta love attorneys. Glad Scott's on here. Yeah. So, that's how we bring people together. We bag on each other. Scott's on here. I get to joke on him.
Perfect.
So, one of the things that's really interesting, y'all both have talked about the story and the creation and making sure that the whiskey is true to itself, because there is terroir in bourbon and whiskey, American whiskey in particular. So I'm going to ask 2 questions. Question 1 is, what is your favorite region of America from a distillation perspective? Because you all have explored this. And then 2, what is your most unique distillery you've been to? Doesn't necessarily have to be the best whiskey you've tried, but what is the most unique distillery that you all have gone to and sourced whiskey? Because for those who don't know, Adam and Nora have to go and visit the distilleries that they are working with before they source their product. And Chase and Devin, I think you all traditionally have done the homework or done the article for the mashandgrain.com before you all source whiskey from their product. So there's similarities in that perspective as well. So ladies first, because I'm a Southern gentleman, even if you don't believe Kentucky is Southern, it is. Nora, I'll let you go first here. So it's a two-part answer.
So setting aside Kentucky and Tennessee, because I feel like that's an easy, like those being the favorite regions, it's also probably not as applicable to our companies, even though great whiskey is from there, and we've worked with the Kentucky distillery. Setting that aside, I think personally my favorite region is the Southwest. What is happening with Mesquite Smoke Single Malt for us is super, super, super exciting, because it's, to us, one of the first non-bourbon based emergent American styles of whiskey. So I think for that reason, especially like Santa Fe Spirits and Whiskey Del Bach, I know we've both worked with Whiskey Del Bach, beloved by, I think, both of these teams, great people, but also just doing something that's really, really unique and special and innovative. So super into what they're doing. It's catching on. We're very excited. We put out a small blend that's called Mega Whiskey that came from Whiskey Del Bach juice, and that sold out so much faster than we expected because it's a style that's still emerging, and we're so psyched about that. So it's generally for people who don't like peated whiskey but like a little smoke. It's great.
For sure.
What was the word you used? The most
unique,
interesting,
unique, interesting, like one that kind of just caught your eye, right? Like it was like, man, this is something a lot of people might not get to experience. They're making pretty good whiskey, and we want to highlight them.
Yeah, I'll go.
I've got one.
I've got one. So they're not going to be the same. I'm gonna talk about 888 on Nantucket. I think. Cool. So also single malt. We don't only do single malt. It's also not necessarily my favorite thing, but I think in some ways people are pushing the boundaries a little bit more in single malt. So they're on Nantucket. In our opinion, they make some of the very, very, very best American single malt. Period. It's insane. It's also $400 to $500, and they only sell it. Well, they're actually branching out, but they only sell it on Nantucket. And it's the kind of thing where Nantucket is probably the only place where you can sell out of $500 bottles of whiskey, but it's also spectacular. It's on the water. It has all of the maritime vibe of Scotland. So that's super interesting to us. It's the most Scotch-like out of any of the single malts that we've worked with. And it's like truly special 12 to 15-year-old single malt. It's pretty unheard of in the craft space. And it's a special experience, not our cheapest distillery visit to go out to Nantucket and have to stay there and spend a day, but it's definitely, it was an experience for sure to take the ferry out there.
The world's smallest violin is playing for you guys for having to go out to Nantucket and enjoy nice whiskey. My heart goes out to you.
Well, it was one of the last, I don't travel as much anymore. Adam does most of the travel now. So it was one of my last distillery visits. I know.
I've heard a lot about 888, and it's one of those things that I have not gotten the pleasure to enjoy because we I feel as a podcast, even though we're bourbon focused, we've really tried to beat the drum of American single malt as much as we possibly can. So that is definitely on the bucket list of things to accomplish in 2024, because 2023 space for the podcast is running out very quickly. So Adam, we'll go to you. We'll just keep it up there. What about you? Regionality and most unique distillery.
Well, region-wise, I was going to say the Southwest also, but to keep it interesting, I'll actually change it up and say the Midwest, which I think that like Midwest and the Great Plains states, there are many distilleries there that I think are making really good and interesting bourbon and rye in particular that tend to have a pretty low profile outside of that region. A lot of them are actually like decently sized, making a couple thousand barrels a year, which for newer distilleries is pretty big.
Yeah.
You just don't really make it that much to any big cities besides Chicago and Minneapolis, and they just drink it all there. So places like Cedar Ridge in Iowa, which is the best-selling bourbon in Iowa, and outsells Jim Beam by 30% now. And Wollersheim in Wisconsin, and 45th Parallel in Wisconsin, and a bunch of other places around there, and a lot of them using local grains and things like that. And for my single distillery to highlight, I promise I'm not pandering to the audience here, but I do really think that, and even though your audience mostly knows about them, what the folks at Frey Ranch are doing is really so special and tells so much about the story of whiskey, when like so many other distilleries we work with are still like putting a lot of work in just to manage to source all their grain from their own estate. And that's like a multi-year challenge to get to that point. And then Frey Ranch is growing all of their grains themselves. And no one else can do that. And it's such a unique story. And really, like, there's no better way to explain to someone what whiskey is and where it comes from. Plus, as you know, they've done everything right. They didn't put their whiskey out until it was already quite good. And it looks really good. And they invested in telling that story. And it's just has made them a rising star that I'm still surprised on the East Coast that people usually don't know about. On the West Coast, everyone's all over them. But in New York and the Northeast, people usually have not tried them yet.
Well, there's a couple things. One is you carry that bottle into a bar fight if you're going into one. That's first and foremost, because that thing's heavy. Secondly is I don't know if there's better people in the whiskey business than Colby and Ashley Frey and the entire distillery team that is there. They're second to none. And as you mentioned, I think this goes without saying, their whiskey is just, it's rock solid. And then the weird arid climate of northern Nevada, not Nevada, folks, Nevada. I got corrected many times while I was out there. They'll tell you that, and it's super interesting. And they play around. I think the most unique thing for me, because I've been there, is that they have their own malting house. Like no one's doing that. Like that there makes it super unique to me personally. Like from a distillery view perspective, and the fact that they can grow all the grains, like insane. All right, guys. So we're going to the long format time. Now you all have to figure out how to keep it short. I'm going to just give you all a warning. Devin, I will go to you last because it's C before D. So Chase.
Ooh, okay. Then I will say to pick a new region and one near and dear to myself because I'm from there, the Mid-Atlantic, the Pennsylvania, Northern Virginia area, New Jersey. We haven't talked to anyone from New Jersey, so I can't speak intelligently, but like I think what they're doing in the rye space, kind of going back to those historic roots, reviving some old varietals of rye, Monongahela and the likes, I think is actually really great. And rye is one of those grains that like the flavor profile is so wide that like a couple tweaks to it makes a big difference.
And I'm glad you said that stuff, like that word that starts with an M. I cannot say it, so I'm glad you said it for the audience.
Yeah,
I'm glad he said it this year and not 2 years ago.
And then I will most unique. I don't know. So I'm gonna just go back for easy purposes from the first time we recorded, and you asked a similar question. There's a small distillery called Shadow Ridge or SR Distilling. It's Sky Sean Hallman, is that his name, right, Devin?
Yeah.
And he has a full-time job. He's from the military. He's doing this on a part-time basis. And what I really found refreshing was everyone thinks about distilling, unlike brewing, it needs to be this massive scale production thing. And he found a way to keep his full-time career, to release a label, to do, share a production space and distillation space. And I think the kind of the personal endeavor of doing something like that on top of a career is completely unique. And I think with that, he's not so beholden to, he needs a certain kind of bourbon and a certain kind of rye or a certain kind of single malt. He really is out there experimenting and kind of just letting his heart guide his process. And that was one of the more inspiring conversations I think we've had.
And I think you took Devin's answer. So Devin, you can, for the audience, share the same answer if you so choose, but you've interviewed quite a few.
There's also a few that I've personally visited that we have not yet featured on the website, but hopefully will one day. But I'll keep it to the partnerships that we've made so far. I'll say as a region, I think New York. I know that's getting like very micro, but it's near and dear to my heart. I'm obviously biased. I lived in New York City for 15 years, worked at Kings County Distillery, but when I think about the whiskey coming just out of the city and then not even considering what happens when you go upstate and it opens a whole other, can of worms. You look at Kings County, you look at Brooklyn Distilling, you look at New York Distilling Company, you look at Van Brunt Stillhouse. Even within, honestly, mostly that's in Brooklyn, and the Fort Hamilton came on right towards the end there. There's so much great whiskey happening just in that one tiny little borough of this city. And then when you expand it upstate to Copper Sea and Black Button and all the other incredible Tuttletown, all the other incredible distilleries in New York State, it feels silly. We're talking about these sort of general regions to just name a state, but the sheer vast variety of distilleries in New York State, I think, is unique. And what they have been building over the last 8 years or so with the Empire Rye movement and trying to create a distinctive New York style of whiskey, I think is a really cool thing that we've gotten to witness over the last decade or so.
For sure. There's a great documentary on Empire Rye out as well. if fire, water, and grain, maybe. I don't know if you all have seen it.
It's like eat, drink, love, or something like that.
No, that's eat, pray, love, and that is not
right.
the.
No, yeah.
A link to the documentaries will be in the show notes.
Yes, it
right?
will.
Isn't that what your podcast?
Oh, there you go. Make some extra work for him, Chase. Good job. No, I was going to talk about Shadow Ridge because it is an incredible story, and not just for the reason that Chase mentioned, but also just because it's a different model for getting into the industry. And I think that is what made it a compelling story for our readers is there is a way to be a part of this game and to do things the way you want to do them and to not have to empty your 401k or quit your day job. It's a hard way to do it, but there are other ways. So I think that was refreshing. But to give a different answer, I'll bring it home to Colorado, which is I'll talk about Storm King out in Montrose, Colorado. They recently won a huge award. They won, world's best blended whiskey at the World Whiskey Awards. And what I think is cool about them is that, again, it's another distillery started by just a person who loves whiskey, probably didn't think about, how much they were biting off before they jumped into the waters here. But what I appreciate about them is that they don't necessarily have like a set flagship. They started off doing all these sort of experimental runs, experimental distillations. They barreled a bunch of stuff using different cooperage. Now they release this incredible blended whiskey called Side Gig, where they get to really play around with all these different flavor profiles they've created through that experimentation. But even with their bourbon releases, it's different mash bills, it's different styles of cooperage. So what I like about Storm King is that, you find a lot of these distilleries, they're doing really great stuff, but 80% of the year they're running this mash bill, and then 15% of the year they're running this mash bill, and then 5% of the year they're running this mash bill, and that gives them three bases, and then they can play around with it. Storm King is, I don't want to make it sound bad, but I feel like they're just kind of like throwing some stuff out there and seeing what comes back. And I find that incredibly invigorating. I obviously they're doing things the right way because they're getting the adulation and the accolades that they deserve. But I am just interested to continue to see how their releases change and evolve over time.
No, those are all interesting. So a couple things. I was surprised no one picked the Northwest, right? Because that was where the American single malt movement started, and that has gained a lot of traction and acclaim. And then the region of just the state of Colorado, right? Because if I were to pick a state that I would go to outside of Kentucky or Tennessee, I would be venturing to Colorado because there's so much great whiskey. American single malt, bourbon, rye whiskey, and unique varieties. You have the whiskey at the tallest point being made in the world at Breckenridge. You have some cool stuff with the Aspen staves at 291. So I'd pick Colorado. And from a unique perspective, I don't know. This is going to sound weird. Unique is Jack Daniel's. And it's unique because they just produce so much whiskey. Like, it is just nuts. Like, I kind of had an idea of what it would look like because I'd seen Buffalo Trace and I'd seen Heaven Hill. You have really no idea how much whiskey's being produced in Lynchburg, Tennessee until you go and see it. Like, that's what makes it unique to me personally. And the great thing about it is I think Chris Fletcher and the team at Brown-Forman just overall have supported their ability to be craft and do crafty things, right? Do single malt, do innovative things with barrel cooperage and so on and so forth. And so it is fun when the big guys play like a little guy in a little bit. So I don't know if that's a cop-out for you all, but I think for me, just the sheer vastness of Jack Daniel's is unique in itself. That thing is a monster.
What I'll say is interesting about what Jack Daniel's is doing, and actually Adam brought this up at a panel that I can't remember. I actually think it was the American Single Malt panel at ADI. What's interesting about Jack Daniel's, or for example, Jim Beam putting out an American Single Malt, or Buffalo Trace, and all these other big, commercial distilleries opening small, like experimental distilleries, which were basically the size of a craft distillery or something like that, mid-level craft distillery, is how the craft movement over the last several decades has influenced what the big guys are doing now. Because it makes you wonder if some of these local state laws and stuff like that that helped these distilleries be able to attain the licenses to be able to open these distilleries over the last decade, 2 decades, I feel like it's impossible to like put a pin in exactly when this movement started. But if these laws didn't start to change, would Jack Daniel's be releasing all these like different things? Would Jim Beam have put out a single malt whiskey? Would, Buffalo Trace be selling a very expensive peated bourbon? I don't think so, because they would have no incentive to do it. I think it's interesting how the story of craft has started to change. I won't say it's changed, but started to change from, look at all these, young new distilleries aging whiskey in 5-gallon barrels, putting it out after 12 months, and it all tastes hot and young. And why is it $60 when I can buy Elijah Craig for 30? And, from that conversation to where we are now, and I'll keep picking on Buffalo Trace, but, Buffalo Trace putting out a 375 milliliter bottle of peated bourbon, and it's more expensive than the full-size 750 peated bourbon from Kings County Distillery, who was one of the first distilleries, if not the first distillery, to make that style. So now we've got, a big industrial commercial distillery putting out a more expensive, smaller bottle experimental whiskey that a craft producer is selling at a full size for less. So it's been an interesting trajectory of the last several decades.
Yeah, and I think we can hit on that for a second. Is the whiskey landscape as a whole, right? Because 10 years ago there was maybe 2,000 distilleries, maybe hundreds, right?
In 2010, I believe there were 195 total distilleries in this country.
Okay.
That's right.
So I feel like there's a new distillery in every moment in Kentucky. Like literally I get up to a governor's newsletter. Oh, we've welcomed a new member of the KDA. Okay. Where is this person located? Now we're talking about thousands of distilleries just popping up left and right.
Where do you think Scott is right now?
So, I think that's the interesting thing is the landscape of this boom, right? And people are like, oh, the bubble's going to bust. The bubble. That's the whiskey bubble. I think that's a figment of our imagination because there's this thing called China and there's this thing called India that's got like billions of folks. And if they adopt just a sliver of whiskey hope, then all of this is not for naught. But we can't even keep the American people happy yet with the amount of whiskey. So what's your all's idea of how an independent bottler can help? How can you all help perpetuate the story to the American or to the international person to enjoy these whiskeys? Because you're telling a story as well. You're picking these from a single cask perspective or from a blend perspective to tell a story of how these whiskeys mingled together or how they are a sum of the whole parts of the distillery based upon these oddities and barrels that you find. So like, how does this independent bottler help improve the whiskey movement here in America?
Yeah, I think for me, it fits into our overarching story, which is that great whiskey comes from all across the country. It is not just coming from Kentucky and Tennessee and Indiana, although great whiskey does come from there, obviously. But normalizing the idea that great whiskey can come from Nevada or Texas or Massachusetts or wherever else it may be, and helping people actually discover these things. It's the whiskey world has been doing things in a certain way for a really long time, and now that 90% of the distilleries in the country have opened in the last 10 or 12 years, people are doing things in new ways all the time. And some of those things are working really, really well. And people just need to know about it. And sometimes it's nice to have someone else in your corner besides yourself saying how good your whiskey is. That every distillery says that their whiskey is worth trying. But we're the ones who, as independent bottlers, are going around and really hunting down those diamonds and helping people find out about them.
Yeah, it's Adam's entire job to understand the landscape of American whiskey so that when we say, hey, Free Ranch is worth tasting, people can trust that we actually have that context or a place that no one has heard of. And for us, it's helping people understand. So something like our Far Flung Bourbon, which is a blend of bourbon from 4 places, that for us is a statement about where bourbon is. outside of what people think of for Kentucky and Tennessee. But that plus any of the other stuff we do is a way for people to know that we've kicked the tires and here's a distillery that they wouldn't know about otherwise and that they should give a try, assuming that they trust our palates and have had other stuff that they like from us. So it's curation. And I think that is required at a certain point. There are something like 2,600 distilleries. We can't keep up. And that's his full-time job to keep up with this. And so anyone else, it becomes impossible. And so two people that are interested in and learning more were that pipeline to help people continue driving to those interesting smaller distilleries that they wouldn't know about otherwise.
I think too, like from our perspective, with blended American whiskey, there's a couple things. So we talked about a little bit about how the craft movement, these small producers, we're starting to see noticeable influence on the large producers, which I think is really cool. What I think is, continuing to evolve and develop is going to be the consumer palate for the changes and for these differences, because the palate has been so attuned to Kentucky bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, and MGP for such a long time. And with these 2,600 distilleries out there, some of them doing some very unique and different things, I think, there's going to be people who really adapt and adopt those unique flavor profiles. And I think there are going to be people that take a little bit longer to come around to that. So I think that's going to be another interesting thing. And something where independent bottlers and blending houses can be a part of that evolution and be a part of that conversation. And in a big way, that's what Chase and I are trying to do with the Borrowed Page project, which is, take incredible product that is being made by these small producers, but blend it in a way that creates something that is probably different than something that you've tasted before. All of the releases are meant to sort of push the boundary of what American whiskey is or can be. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that part of the evolution of the story continues to go. And I think that that's a really unique space that independent bottlers and blending houses can fit in.
And I'm gonna tack on not so much about independent bottling, but you made a comment about, is the market saturated? Which is an interesting comment. And if you run the clock 10 years, 11 years, 12 years, whatever it is, the same comments were being made about kind of local brewery production. And craft, distilleries are now equal to the size of the volume of independent producers as breweries were 10 years ago, 11 years ago, when people thought that market was saturated, right before the hockey stick moment, it ballooned up to almost 10,000 producers. You compound that with like what Devin's saying is like, I think whiskey, what the expression of whiskey can be, what flavor profiles that can be created with regionalization, experimentation, things like that. Like, I don't think we are saturated yet. I actually think there's a huge opportunity for localized production. Not everyone needs to go be the next, Jim Beam, so to speak, but like, small local producers trying to figure out what a Boise whiskey should taste like. I'm picking on Boise. I don't know anyone out that way. I think there's actually a really huge opportunity for us to kind of mimic, what brewing has done. Just with kind of consciously acknowledging the fact that like the barrier of creating a distillery is higher than that of a brewery. So I think the trajectory, the growth curve of that will be a little bit slower because it takes time to bring product to market. Experimentation, iteration's a little bit slower. The laws are a little bit more stringent. I respect all that, but I actually think there's still a huge opportunity, and I don't think the market's saturated for local producers.
Well, and to piggyback off of your piggyback, so this is like a double piggyback or like a piggyback squared situation. Thinking about what Chase was talking about was sort of like how the laws are different. It'll also be interesting to see how things like direct to consumer or, just barrier to entry. I think that we should all be pushing on a local and federal level to make it a little bit more approachable and affordable for people to get into the distilling industry. Because not only will that generate more distilleries that are creating more diverse products, but you're also getting a larger and more diverse set of voices coming into that industry. So the more that we can sort of diversify, who can be in the game and who can be like be a part of the conversation, all of that is going to help, I think, with that sort of hockey stick moment that I don't believe the spirits or the whiskey industry in this country has hit yet.
Yeah, and I think you all hit on something that me as a consumer is worried about, and I know I've had a snag because I've wanted to purchase whiskey before, is the ability for the consumer to get it, right? Because once you live in this industry, and I'm the minority here, right? Because I'm talking to a larger audience. Like I want to try different things. And so like when Lost Lantern puts out a great Still Austin pick, and then I go to where it is being consumed or like where I can purchase it from, and they're like, oh, can't get it in the mail. But by damn sure, if my wife wanted to sign up for the wine club of the month, that can come through the mail. Right. So it's like there's all these games and lobbies being played that I think the American consumer needs to be very aware of to engage so that the independent bottler can get people sips to lips, right? They talk about the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, but just in general, right? Like the idea is how can a distillery get sips to lips? Well, they can partner with an independent bottler through a blend, through a single cask, and then the consumer can get that because you all have built brands that they trust, right? I think that's the allure of what happened in Scotland. I just almost went with an accent. I don't know why. In like Scotland, right? Like if I know Signatory has this barrel, like I want that Signatory barrel, right? Like I know that that's really good whiskey. And that's the same thing that you all have kind of created with your all's background and with your all's, pedigree. It doesn't take over time, right? This is a slow going process on your all's end as well. But people now trust your palates. People trust your experience, and now they want to buy it. But if they can't get it, that's the hard part. You just need me to come blend with you. We'll make sure everyone gets the trusted experience.
I see you eyeballing that next guest blender spot. All right.
Yes. Done and done. I'm actually here. Like I'm in Kentucky. Like it doesn't get much easier than that. Just you make sure I get a couple weeks advance notice. I'll take off work and I'm there. I did give you restaurant recommendations when you were here.
You did. You didn't have dinner with me, but you did give me the recommendation. Yeah.
Yes. It is short notice. I tried. I tried. It failed miserably, but I tried.
Kids, right?
Yeah. Kids. Silly kids. But yeah, what's your all's opinion on like just the sips to lips and the aggravation that it can cause to get whiskey places in the United States?
It's super frustrating for so many producers. And I think even if that was solved immediately, even if it became like wine where you can do a whiskey club and ship around the country, and a lot of places would do that, I still think a lot of distilleries are going to stay regional or stay in their state. Like some places want to scale up to a $150 million distillery or a $200 million distillery and do something huge. And other people just don't want that. They want one that can service their region or their state, and that's what they're happy with, doing a couple thousand barrels a year. And if you're doing that, you can't build a national brand that's available in all 50 states. And I think that a lot of places are going to be satisfied with that. Like we see that with beer. Like we have incredible beer in Vermont, and a lot of it is only available at the brew pub or like only available in Vermont, like Heady Topper, which is helped make the hazy IPA craze start. It was only available here for a really long time. And I think
that was part of the hype.
Yeah.
So there's also
we had Heady Topper. Chase and I had Heady Topper just on Labor Day.
Nice.
For my first time. I flown out.
I'd had it a bunch. So.
We can buy it at the gas station up here. So
yeah, it is definitely
But I think that's what it's going to be like more and more as there are more producers. There are some few that are going to try to go really big with it and go wide, and there are others that are going to own their local market, and others that are really, really local.
Yeah. But I also think that that's where IBs come in, and having people have access to what we're doing. And because we work with two main partners, shipping like retailers that can ship to 40 states, which is good, but we're still missing some. And I think if there was a mechanism for our types of companies to be more national and then the distilleries can stay regional, it creates an ecosystem that then someone like you, Jake, or your listeners who want access to these things, they can get it, even if they can't necessarily get like the exact release from the distillery, they can taste it and get a sense of what's going on and then decide if they want to go track it down some other way. But having those shipping laws, the DTC laws, even at parity with wine, would be huge for the industry at large.
Well, and the other thing, right, is my lawyer's not on here, so I can't really get into too many things. But what I will say, and we talked about this not too long ago with somebody, but like, let's be honest, the idea of the 3-tier system hasn't changed since Prohibition, right? And think about what DTC and the, if that law, like that could change as well, right? Where the consumer could get a better buy and the brands could get a better, price back to them in those market opportunities. Like that's huge. And so like, I pay attention to all the little things that these big players are doing worldwide, right? Like Brown and Forman starting their own distribution in Japan, or, some of these other like places. You watch it carefully and like, how are they going to impact the American market? Because they have to try it somewhere before they can try to bring it here. And so I think that is another game that the American consumer bourbon is getting premiumized. That's not a word, but there's premiumization. That's not a word either, maybe. Or maybe I'm making up words.
Marketing
that's a word that is used, whether or not it's
an MBA word.
Okay, sweet. But like it's becoming to where like everything is $79.99 or $99.99 or $150.99. Like that's fine, but for average Joe who wants to go pick up a whiskey or make it special, they want to be able to buy the $39 bottle and they want to buy the $69 bottle if it's a gift, right? And that market is being squeezed so tight. And I think that's from a consumer perspective, that's getting harder to deal with as well. Because of the distribution.
I think that, it's something that we've struggled with a lot. For our existence, we have been exclusively sold online. And part of that model was because we did want to be able to have borrowed page, in most places. And with our retailer, we're able to get into 47 states. But, something else that, Adam brought up at ADI, I promise I'm not Adam's PR rep, but he is a super smart.
No, that's Amy Marnoff. She's great.
Yeah. He is a super smart guy with a super cool hair color. And I think that, with what Adam and Nora are doing, what Chase and I are doing, we're buying premium whiskey from craft producers. They need to sell their whiskey at a certain price.
Yep.
We can't buy their whiskey and then go and undercut them and
100%.
Sell their whiskey for less. So, then when you're in an online model like we are, with Mash and Grain, our borrow page is at $75. And I think $75 is a perfectly fair price to pay for something where only 900 bottles are produced, and it's a whiskey that that is unlike anything else. And I could continue to try to throw out the PR notes for our own thing, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. But
Scott, you hear that?
But, at the end of the day, I think that's a fair price, and it's a price that keeps us from undercutting our partners.
Well, for sure.
But the consumer needs to pay tax.
Yeah.
And they need to pay shipping.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, that $75 bottle of whiskey is in the 90s.
Yep.
And I still think it's worth that, but that shrinks the kind of person that we can get this bottle into their hands, which takes away a little bit of what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
So it is frustrating. And, just to talk about DTC a little bit, we had a very interesting conversation with Becky Harris, who's the president of the, American Craft Spirits Association, the head distiller and co-founder of Catoctin Creek in Virginia. And she was talking about, this sort of concept that direct to consumer would basically like ruin wholesalers like ruin like their jobs or make their lives harder or basically make them obsolete. But that's actually not what the research or the data would show. The data shows that DTC would actually probably improve the way that wholesalers would be able to do business, because now a company in Virginia can go ahead and they can start to build a fan base in Ohio, right? Because they can ship to them. So now they can go to a distributor in Ohio and say, here's how many sales we're already doing in your region. This is obviously a popular thing. And it's sort of I don't know if it de-risks it totally, but it makes it more appealing for a wholesaler to go, yeah, you're right, we should try to carry your product. So I actually think that DTC, it would change the relationship a little bit, but it's not like it would destroy wholesalers or distributors. And in some ways, I think it would actually make for a better model for them as well.
Well, and now Adam and Nora, you all have experienced both ways. You've gone D2C and you are in retail stores in select states and markets. So what's that like for you all to kind of see the change, right? Because originally it was all D2C and now you're seeing the distribution model really kind of play itself out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually like speaks to that point in some ways, that for us, like we can go to these stores and a lot of them, especially in New York, well, New York and California are the only places really that we're in. We're a little bit in Kentucky, but primarily New York and California. And most of these retailers have gotten requests for our product because people know about it, because we have this online presence. And so they know that there is demand already. So that's really helpful. We don't have to do the pitch where people have never heard of us before, where we're trying to place a product, especially when you're an independent bottler, where you have to, there's some education that goes into that. If they already have read some stuff about us, or gotten requests for our products, it really helps with that cadence and that conversation. But it is like, it's a totally different conversation, because the interesting thing about going into bars and stores is you need to have consumer demand, but you're actually selling to a buyer. And that's a whole can of worms that is a really interesting kind of thing that people don't understand about what it means to go into these places. Is they need that understanding of the demand before they want to buy a case of your product. Otherwise it's going to sit on the shelf, versus DTC where it's people are buying it and that's how it moves. It's definitely a different model, but I think it's in the way the consumer mindset right now is one where you want to be in a place where people walk in and see your product and go, oh, I've read about this. Snag it.
Yeah. No, I mean, and obviously glass doesn't ship the most perfectly into in the world, right? And so if anyone's like me from a consumer standpoint, you don't buy insurance and then you're like, oh, crap on a stick. Luckily, I've only had one. Yes, I did knock on wood. My bar is Butcher Block. And I've only had one bottle leak, never cracked. Thank God. Because that would be messy. And luckily being here, I'm so close to the distributor. I just normally just drive up the street. Brand needs to drop something off to my house. But, this has been really educational. I think this is part one, right? Part two will come down the line. These guys will continue to put out whiskey, and we will highlight that on bourbonlens.com and through the podcast. So stay tuned for volume 2 of this. I want to make sure that they know that they are welcome back here, even though they may decline our invitation to that. But we would be remiss if we didn't let you all do your all's elevator pitch. So Nora or Adam, whichever one of the two of you wants to do that. And then obviously Chase is telling me that Devin has to do that. So to close us out, we will let Lost Lantern give their elevator pitch, where they can find, where people can find out more about your all's whiskey, and just a little tiny bit about your product on the way out. So Nora, I think you are getting the nod from Adam to be your spokesperson for Lost Lantern.
Cool. So Lost Lantern, as you said before, we buy whiskey from distilleries all over the country. We either put them out as single casks with full transparency on where they come from, or we create small blends with a single distillery, or blend across multiple distilleries. So full range of styles of sourced American only whiskey. You can find us lostlanternwhiskey.com or on Instagram primarily at Lost Lantern Whiskey.
Yeah, and a couple of the favorites lately have been our Far Flung Bourbon, blend of straight bourbon from Frey Ranch in Nevada, Watershed in Ohio, Boulder Spirits in Colorado, and Still Austin in Texas. And yes, I have rattled those off once or twice before. And Soaring Spice. And Soaring Spice, a blend of multiple casks from Frey Ranch, and Gentle Giant, Texas single malt from Balcones Distilling that won Best American Single Malt at the San Francisco World Spirits Competition.
Just a little bit, it was good, and I did select that one as my favorite. Out of the three blends that you all had. First, I did really like Gentle Giant. Soaring Spice is great. So is Far Flung. But the piece de resistance out of that last summer of bourbon was definitely the Still Austin cask that you all found out. Like, that thing was chef kiss good. So if you can find a bottle of that floating, because I think they're all sold out by now, go and...
We have a couple...
Like 6 left on the website.
6 left. Heard it now. Go get them.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm a real rogue over here. How do you guys come up with the names for those?
Good question.
So
I have my 18th century rhyming dictionary and alliterative dictionary, and I use that to we just want something that's evocative of how the whiskey makes us feel more than what it tastes like. And we do like alliteration. It's in the name of our company, so we've done a lot of that with But
the name products are the blends. So single casks don't have names, but it means that if there's a name, it means we've done some part of blending.
We've done more than just selected.
Yeah.
Adam was a big Fortnite Season 1 fan where every one of the little locations that you dropped at was an alliteration. So that's where they came up with, because it was during COVID.
I love it.
Cool.
All right. So Devin, give us your elevator pitch for Borrowed Page and more or less Mash and Grain as well.
I'm going to do my best. I always think it's hilarious that Chase makes me do the elevator pitches because I'm the most long-winded person that I've ever met in my entire life. But so Mash and Grain, American Mash and Grain, mash the letter N grain.com. We feature a new whiskey distillery from around the country on the website every month. We do very deep dive, holistic, long form articles. So if you really want to know everything that there is to know about a distillery outside of maybe going to their own distillery and in some cases, or their own website, and in some cases, I would say more than what's on their own website, I would say come to Mash and Grain. We really try to do justice to the incredible stories of these people that are changing the landscape of American whiskey. The Borrowed Page Project, we work with the distilleries that we've featured on our website. We blend multiple styles of whiskey together. So bourbons, rye, single malt, wheat whiskey, single pot still, oats, whatever you got out there, we're going to blend all that stuff together to try to create distinctive and unique American blended whiskeys that are different than anything you've ever tasted before, while using the individual characteristics of the sourced whiskey that we got from our partnerships to shine that light, to quote both of our websites, back on the producers that make them. You can find us on social media, basically across the board at Mash, the letter N, Grain. And keep an eye on us. We've got some new content that we're going to be releasing, different kinds of content at the end of this year. And keep your eyes peeled for Volume 3 dropping TBD.
All right. Well, that is called a tease in the business. And so definitely be paying attention to both of these guys' social media accounts. They do a great job keeping you abreast. And as always, you can go over to bourbonlens.com because we will have all their press releases. As soon as they hit our email box, they'll be up over there. And we just want to say thank you guys for putting up with our shenanigans on the first run of this and coming back and doing it again for a second time. We truly appreciate it. As always, if you want to know more about Bourbon Lens, go over to Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bourbon Lens. And yes, Twitter is now X. I get it. We'll figure it out eventually. Last but not least, do us a favor. Go over your favorite podcast listening app. Smash the subscribe button. Maybe one too many whiskeys tonight. And give us a 5-star review. We truly appreciate it. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.